They caught us completely by surprise inside our own trenches. Those are the words of a German prisoner captured near Sainte-Marie-du-Mont on the morning of June 6, 1944. His name did not survive in the record, neither did his rank. What survives is a fragment of an interrogation report and the outline of what happened to him. He had been posted to an artillery position that fired blind on pre-registered coordinates toward the beach the Allies would later call Utah. Sometime after 8:30 that morning, the position stopped answering. By the time anyone tried to reconstruct why the guns were destroyed, the crews were dead, captured, or running, and the man who spoke those 11 words had already been marched off toward the rear by soldiers he'd had no time to identify. He didn't know he had just survived one of the most famous small unit actions in military history. We don't know his face. We don't know his hometown. What we can reconstruct is his unit. 6. Battery IQ, Abteilung, Gebergs Artillery Regiment 191, part of the 91, Luftlande Infanterie Division, a division built for a different war than the one it fought. It had been raised and equipped for air landing operations, trained to be flown into a battle rather than dug into one. By the spring of 1944, it had been folded into the static coastal defense of the Cotentin Peninsula instead, its light mountain howitzers pressed into a role they were never designed for, its ammunition lines already strained before a single Allied soldier hit the ground. This was not an inexperienced formation. It was a misplaced one. The division had spent the months before the invasion training for a mission it would never receive, a large-scale air landing operation somewhere on the continent, executed by glider and transport aircraft under Luftwaffe control. That training left it well-drilled in coordination and mobility, and almost entirely without practice defending a fixed coastal position against a determined ground assault. Its officers had studied maps of terrain they were never sent to. What they got instead was a stretch of Norman hedgerow country they had occupied for only a few months, learning its fields of fire the same way any newly arrived garrison would. Yet nothing in that experience explained what had just happened at Brécourt. This isn't a retelling of a television episode. It isn't a tribute reel built around one company's reputation. What follows is a reconstruction built from German war diaries, American after-action reports, post-war interrogation files, and decades later, the physical ground itself, excavated and read like a document in its own right. The record does not always agree with the legend. Where it disagrees, the record wins. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's standing order to every strong point along this coast was simple: hold the position to the last man. Weeks earlier, Major von der Heide had written to his own superiors warning that his regiment was fully prepared for an air landing invasion, but only partially equipped for sustained ground combat against a determined infantry assault. Both statements describe the same underlying problem from opposite ends of the chain of command: a defense built on rigid orders and static positions, about to meet an enemy whose entire method was to ignore the plan the moment it stopped working. Start with who was actually there. Popular accounts have spent 80 years insisting that elite German paratroopers defended the guns at Brécourt Manor. The German order of battle says otherwise. The 4 10.5-centimeter mountain howitzers positioned along the hedgerow belonged to conventional Wehrmacht artillerymen, not Fallschirmjäger, and certainly not the Waffen-SS. The nearest SS formation, the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, was still south of Carentan that morning and would not meet American paratroopers for another 4 days. The regiment responsible for the Brécourt guns, Gar 191, was commanded by Oberstleutnant Heinrich Kiewit, working out of a command post at Les Carrières, several kilometers from the battery itself. Nearby, elements of Grenadier Regiment 1058 held the approaches to Saint-Côme-du-Mont, and a reserve company of Grenadier Regiment 9 Nîmes, under an officer recorded only as Oberleutnant Glube, sat closer still at Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, close enough on paper to reinforce the battery if it came under attack. Whether any of those men actually reached the position in time is a separate question from whether they were assigned to defend it, and the record does not confirm they arrived. Archaeologists have since found something the memoirs missed: concentrations of German machine gun casings inside the firing trenches themselves, evidence that the gun crews did not abandon their position without a fight. They manned their own defense inside a shallow ammunition trench never designed to stop infantry. The battery was operational. The Americans were scattered. Neither side yet understood what the other was doing, because from the German side, the invasion did not begin with the sight of the enemy. It began with the loss of information. Hours before dawn, General Lieutenant Wilhelm Falle, commanding the 91st Division, was ambushed and killed while returning to his own headquarters, a single event that paralyzed the division's command structure before its coastal batteries had fired a shot in anger. Telephone lines, the nervous system of the entire static defense, were being cut faster than anyone could repair them. To the Corps headquarters processing the reports, the picture forming was not "Americans have landed at Brécourt." It was something vaguer and far more unsettling. Paratroopers scattered across the peninsula in numbers no one could confirm, attacking positions no one had time to name. Nobody yet knew whether this was the main invasion or a diversion. Nobody yet knew whose men these were. The German command wasn't fighting a company that morning. It was fighting an absence, the sudden disappearance of certainty. At the headquarters of the 709th Infantry Division, under General Lieutenant Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben, the reports arriving that morning described paratroopers cutting communication lines and isolating strongpoints across the entire Sainte-Marie-du-Mont sector without ever settling into a coherent picture of where the main effort actually was. The Regional Corps assessment, written afterward by Michiharu's Army Corps, put it plainly: the enemy was operating in small, decentralized combat groups behind their own lines. A defense doctrine built around holding fixed points against a visible attacker had no procedure for an enemy that refused to present itself as a single, locatable threat. On the situation map at Corps headquarters, the picture that morning read as fragments rather than a front line. A strong point here reporting parachutes overhead, a telephone exchange there going dead mid-sentence, a patrol somewhere near Sainte-Mère-Église failing to report in at all. Some sightings described a handful of men. Others described dozens. None of it could be reconciled into a single coherent line of advance, because there wasn't one. The Americans on the ground that morning were not executing the tidy, converging assault later drawn onto operational maps in hindsight. They were assembling themselves out of whoever had landed nearby, adjusting their objectives on the fly as they found each other in the dark. To the German staff officers trying to plot it, that looked less like an army than like weather. At approximately 8:30, the battery's defenders heard it before they understood it. The sudden, sustained hammer of automatic weapons fire opening up from the direction of the hedgerow to the north. Two machine guns, working in concert, began pouring suppressive fire across the open field south of the position, exactly where German doctrine said an infantry assault should come from. The defenders responded the way their training told them to. They manned their own MG-42s and returned fire into the open ground, bracing for a conventional attack across exposed terrain. That attack never came. While the German guns were fixed on the empty field, a small element had already worked its way into a drainage ditch running directly into the battery's own communication trench. The same trench built to move ammunition between gun bays, not to repel an assault arriving from within the position itself. By 8:45, the first howitzer had been overrun. The hedgerows were tall enough, and the guns loud enough, that the crews at the far end of the position had no way to know the line had already broken. Word didn't travel down the trench the way it was supposed to. It simply stopped. The battery, gun by gun, was going silent from one end. At the artillery command post in Les Carrières, Oberstleutnant Heinrich Kiewit was waiting on the kind of report that comes in every hour during a fire mission. A confirmation, a correction, a request for more rounds. Instead, nothing came. GAR 191's ammunition situation was already strained. Its mountain howitzers were never meant to be resupplied at the pace a coastal artillery unit demanded, and Kiewit's staff had spent the pre-dawn hours managing a logistics problem, not preparing for a ground assault. When the 6th battery stopped transmitting, there was no dramatic message announcing its destruction. There was simply silence where a report should have been, the same silence that was, at that same hour, spreading across telephone exchanges throughout the sector as American pathfinders methodically cut the lines. Kiewit had no way to distinguish a communications failure from a battery being overrun because from his command post they looked identical. Near the site, archaeologists would later recover a mess tin lid with words scratched hastily into the metal, a runner's message, improvised because the wires were already dead. It never arrived in time to change anything. While Kiewit waited for a report that would never come, First Lieutenant Richard Winters was already inside the position. His approach had nothing improvised about it. He had studied the ground first, the guns, their interlocking fields of fire, and the one avenue the German defenders hadn't accounted for, a hedgerow-lined drainage ditch running straight into their own trench system. He split his handful of men into a base of fire and an assault element using two 30-caliber machine guns to pin the German MG-42s in place, while a small group worked into the trench itself. Then, instead of trying to take all 4 guns at once, he moved on them one at a time, clearing a position, using whatever German stick grenades and demolition charges came to hand, then pushing to the next bay before the defenders further down the line had time to organize. It was not reckless, it was sequential, and it was exactly the kind of tactic German coastal doctrine had no answer for. That doctrine had been built for a different threat entirely. Interlocking machine gun fire against infantry crossing open ground, batteries camouflaged against aerial observation, positions built to support one another laterally along the coast. None of it accounted for an assault arriving from behind through the position's own logistics trench. Once Winters's men were inside that trench, the German howitzers, heavy, fixed, impossible to depress or traverse against infantry at close range, became useless in their own defense. The artillerymen were left fighting with bolt-action rifles against Thompson submachine guns and grenades, in a space too narrow and too loud for anyone to accurately judge how many attackers they actually faced. That miscalculation wasn't an accident. The acoustics of the trench, the suppressive fire arriving from multiple angles, and the sheer aggression of the assault combined to make somewhere between 13 and 24 American paratroopers sound and feel like a far larger force. German prisoners taken that day would later estimate they had been hit by something closer to a battalion. It wasn't. It was a fraction of a company, using geometry and noise as force multipliers. By the time the position collapsed, surviving gunners and infantry abandoning the trench for the manor house itself, the fighting had stretched across several hours, not the tight 15-minute skirmish popular retellings prefer. Along the way, Winters found something in a German command dugout that mattered nearly as much as the guns themselves. A detailed situation map, marking artillery positions, machine gun nests, and pre-registered targets across the sector. He passed it to Lieutenant Lewis Nixon, the battalion's intelligence officer, who moved it down the chain fast enough that it reached the forces still fighting their way off Utah Beach. It did not reveal, as legend sometimes claims, every German gun in Normandy. What it revealed was enough, precise and local, and immediately actionable, to help bring the first Sherman tanks inland in support of the beachhead. Set the two accounts beside each other, and the contrast becomes the real story. German after-action assessments from the broader Cotentin sector, filed later by officers like Major Friedrich von der Heydte, commanding the Luftwaffe's 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment nearby, describe American paratroopers fighting with, in his words, unexpected aggressiveness and initiative. Small, decentralized groups operating without waiting for orders, exploiting a kind of confusion the German command structure was never built to absorb. Von der Heydte is often placed at Brécourt itself in popular accounts, supposedly watching the battle unfold from a church tower in Sainte-Marie-du-Mont before ordering his men toward the guns. The archival record doesn't support it. His own post-war writings and the operational research built around them place him elsewhere that morning, managing a sector that was already unraveling, and he did not move toward Sainte-Marie-du-Mont until well after the battery had already fallen silent. What he offered, at length, was analysis, not eyewitness testimony of this specific fight, but a clear post-war account of why static German doctrine kept failing against exactly this kind of assault. Meanwhile, the archaeology tells its own version. Excavations led by researchers from Bordeaux Montaigne University confirm the guns were 10.5 centimeter howitzers, not the 88 millimeter flak cannons of popular memory. They mapped the direction of the American advance, north to south, matching Winters's own account almost exactly. And beneath the trench line, they found the physical proof that this was not a position abandoned without resistance, spent German machine gun casings in concentration, exactly where a defending crew would have stood and fired until they couldn't anymore. The dramatized version of this fight, the one most people know, compresses all of this into something tighter and cleaner than the record supports. It shows a straight, deep WW2-style trench. The ground itself shows a shallow drainage ditch reinforced with logs and sandbags, muddy and improvised. It shows a battle lasting perhaps 15 or 20 minutes. The timeline built from German and American reports together puts the fighting and its immediate aftermath closer to 3 hours. It shows a single officer's dramatic solo charge finishing the position off alone. The record credits reinforcements from D Company brought forward to press a wider flank attack once the position was already breaking. None of these corrections make the action less remarkable. They make it a harder, slower, more exposed piece of infantry work than the compressed version ever suggested, which is, if anything, the more difficult story to have pulled off. A later assessment from the 709th Division would describe the failure in almost clinical terms. The static defenses had been blind to threats originating from the rear. That blindness had a direct, named victim. At WN05, the strong point covering Utah Beach's Exit 2, Lieutenant Arthur Janke commanded the coastal troops the Brécourt Battery existed specifically to support with indirect fire. When the guns behind him went silent, Janke's position lost the one asset that might have slowed the advance off the beach. He never received an explanation for why the fire stopped. From where he stood, the artillery that was supposed to be at his back simply wasn't there anymore. The wider intelligence picture only sharpened after the fact. A post-war assessment of the sector's losses concluded that the compromise of the captured artillery map had damaged the coastal network well beyond the single battery it came from, since the same document that guided American naval gunfire also exposed the positions meant to protect the guns still standing nearby. One piece of paper, carried out of a command dugout by a lieutenant with no formal intelligence training, did more damage to the sector's defensive coherence in the hours that followed than the 4 howitzers themselves had done sitting silent. There is also the matter of who was wearing what. For decades, the camouflage smocks worn by Luftwaffe Fallschirmjäger elsewhere in the sector were mistaken, by American soldiers unfamiliar with German uniform patterns, for the camouflage of the Waffen-SS. That single visual confusion, repeated across dozens of after-action reports and post-war memoirs, is very likely where the entire SS at Brécourt premise originated. It is a mistaken identity problem, not a hidden truth waiting to be uncovered. No SS officer wrote about Easy Company because no SS officer was there to see them. By late morning, the position was finished. 4 howitzers destroyed. Roughly a dozen German prisoners taken, ordinary artillerymen and infantry stragglers, not a single one of them SS. A detail that would have been remarkable enough on its own to appear prominently in American intelligence summaries had it been true. It doesn't appear because it didn't happen. German casualties in and around the trench are harder to pin down precisely than the popular narrative suggests, but they were real. So were American ones, including the death of a warrant officer caught in the same intermingled chaos that defined the whole morning. Archaeologists later found evidence of a field hospital established on the site almost immediately afterward, treating American and German wounded side by side, a detail that belongs in this story as much as the guns do, and one that rarely makes it into the dramatized version. What Brécourt actually accomplished in the hours that followed was to strip a critical piece of indirect fire support away from the German positions covering Utah Beach's Exit 2 at exactly the moment the invasion needed that exit open. The captured map moving down the American chain of command mattered for the same reason. It did not just mark where the guns had been, it told the forces still fighting their way inland which other positions were still live, and where naval gunfire could be aimed next. A single overrun battery and the single sheet of paper taken from inside it reached further into that day's fighting than either side fully appreciated at the time. Now, return to the man who spoke first. Somewhere in the confusion of that morning, he was pulled out of a trench he had expected to defend for hours, not minutes, and marched to the rear as a prisoner of an assault he still could not fully explain. He never learned the name Easy Company. He never learned the name Richard Winters. No surviving German record from 1944 identifies either not the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, not the 101st Airborne, not a single officer by name. To the men who lived through it, this was never Easy Company's assault. It was Amerikanische Fallschirmtruppen, American parachute troops, an anonymous, aggressive force that appeared from a direction no doctrine had prepared for, took the battery apart position by position, and vanished into the wider chaos of the invasion before anyone could ask who they actually were. The identification came later, slowly, through captured maps, insignia pulled from prisoners, and interrogations conducted well after the guns had already gone quiet. On the morning itself, the battery simply disappeared from the German tactical picture, and no one manning that picture ever fully closed the gap between what happened and who had done it. The 91st Division he served in fared no better in the weeks that followed. Ground down in the fighting across the Cottonton, it stopped existing as a coherent formation long before the front reached anywhere near Germany itself. Its own record of that morning left as fragmentary as the man's captor's memory of his face. That is the actual shape of the mystery this story leaves behind. Not admiration from an elite enemy who never set foot on the ground. Not a duel between two famous commanders watching each other from a distance. Just a static defense, built for a war that assumed the enemy would come from the front, meeting an enemy that came from inside its own trench, and a command structure that, hours later, still did not fully know what had hit it. That is why Brécourt is still studied today in staff colleges and professional military education, not as a myth to admire, but as a case study in what happens when initiative meets an institution with no answer for it. It is taught there not as a flawless template, but as a case study in extreme, necessary risk, a reminder that the assault carried a real cost in wounded and dead on both sides, and that it worked because trained men adapted faster than a rigid system could respond, not because the plan itself was perfect. If you enjoy seeing famous WW2 battles reconstructed through both Allied and German records rather than legend alone, subscribe.